Good morning. Thanks for coming. Third talk this morning. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm really honored um, for both the invitation and for the feedback and the discussions that I've had so far. Moving on from the last two talks, today I thought I should talk about the Tamil inscriptions across the seas. And across the seas, I'm not going to refer to the Western Indian Ocean, which I did yesterday, but across the Bay of Bengal. And Tamil, I should start by saying that Tamil was the lingua franca for large parts of peninsular India. So we should not look at it as Tamil as restricted to Tamil Nadu. But, the larger, the lingua franca of large parts of peninsular India, including Karnataka and Kerala as well. So when we look at the entire corpus of Tamil inscriptions, it's very vast. And we did discuss yesterday some of the Tamil Brahmi inscriptions on pottery and on potsherds. So the inscribed shards in the Western Indian Ocean, all the way from the west coast of India to South Arabia and also to the Red Sea. But what I would like to talk more about is the next three, not so much the inscribed, the Tamil Brahmi script on pottery, but the touchstone that was found, the goldsmith's touchstone. So really starting from the 3rd century CE all the way down to the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, there are many, many variations in the kind of Tamil inscriptions we find. In the Brahmi, the pottery that we talked about, it's really names, and we don't get very much. It's only a fragment of some letters or names that are mentioned. But from the 3rd century, the touchstone inscription and further down, and of course the 9th to 14th century inscriptions are fairly long and quite complex inscriptions. But in between, there is also, you will notice, my third point, which is the script, which is the Pallava Grantha script. That's the script that is used, the same script that was being used by the Pallavas in South India, but it is not the language. The script is being used for a variety of languages in Southeast Asia, Sanskrit, Pali, Old Javanese, Mon Khmer languages as well. So it is the script that travels, but not the language when we refer to the Pallava Grantha script. But then again, we do have other inscriptions of the merchant guilds, which is my last point. And in addition, there are several Tamil inscriptions on Buddhist bronzes, which I will also come to. So it's a very diverse and a very mixed corpus that we are looking at. Let me start with the touchstone. This is a goldsmith's touchstone, which was found in South Thailand, specifically at a site called Kwan Lukpat. And the Kwan Lukpat site is known as the bead mound because a lot of beads were found there, a lot of carnelian beads. The carnelian beads you can see on top. The touchstone has the inscription which says that it belongs to the great goldsmith, Perum Patankal. So, and along with this touchstone, along with the beads, there are other finds as well, which were stone molds, coins, pendants, and so on. So why is this touchstone important? Yes, it's an important marker for the presence of the language, but what else does it tell us? And why goldsmith? What is a goldsmith doing in Southeast Asia and Thailand? And was there any gold in Tamil Nadu at that point in time, or was there any gold in South Thailand at this time that required the services of a goldsmith? So a fair amount of gold has been found archaeologically at Tamil sites, particularly the megalithic sites. It's not always possible to see this gold because it's largely in reserve collection. Madras Museum has the gold from the Adichanallur site, which was excavated. It's not on display, but there are bits and pieces that get reported. But the large, the gold jewelry, and also the large gold finds from Adichanallur, the megalithic site, are in the reserve collection in Madras Museum. And we did mention You have to make the gold. You have to write to the curator, fix an appointment, because you see, if it's in the reserve collection, it takes a while for them to take it out. It's not readily available. So you have to make an appointment, and then they will show it to you. So the Adichanna Loot collection is, the first excavation, 1902, the Ria collection, the Ria archaeological excavation. That's a fabulous collection of gold jewelry. But there is also gold from Tamil Nadu in other collections. And this is the sarcophagus and these gold finds that you see at the bottom. These are in Paris, in the Musée Guimet, largely because the site was excavated, Suttakini. This is a site near Pondicherry, Puducherry. And this is a megalithic site. And not an early historic site, and the site was excavated by the French, and hence the gold jewelry and the sarcophagus is now in the collection in Paris. This is a large collection. Again, gold, finding gold in context is very difficult because, as you can imagine, it's not, people who find it don't often report it, and so on and so forth. So a large part of this collection, this is from South Thailand, is in private hands. It's private collection. It is not in museums. And Anna Bennett is the person who has written on it. She's looked at the making of this jewelry and what was the procedure involved and so on and so forth. So the point I'm making with these two slides is that there's a fair amount of gold both in South India at that point, in Tamil Nadu at that point, and in South Thailand. And hence, it makes sense for a goldsmith to be present and to write his name in Tamil, to be involved with the making. No, this is all megalithic. In the center, this is megalithic gold jewelry, so it dates around 1800 BCE.
Because if you look at the gold on the right, the circles are not very well formed, but here the bangles are perfectly spherical.
You see, the problem, if you see, this is not a good slide. It's taken from this thing. But this granular work that you see, there's a lot of this kind of granular work on the ear ornaments here as well. But when Anna Bennett traced that, since she didn't have access to this material, she traced it to North India and to the Gandharan region where you get, Takshila has a lot of gold jewelry, which it has yielded. So, so the point, it's also a methodological issue that when researchers write on it, they often write to what they have access to. If you don't have access to it, then, it just gets under the... Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Is this the only sarcophagus of this kind that was discovered in Tamil Nadu? Because I remember seeing a similar picture of a sarcophagus found in those.
Yes, you're right. This is from this particular site, Sottukeni, but there are other similar sarcophagus. And the point about the megalithic sites around Chennai is that, they are either urn burials in large urns or in terracotta sarcophagi. And not in what we saw on the first day, not in the stone cysts and so on. So there's other examples of that as well. Now, after this early crafts, should one say, use of the Tamil inscription by craftsperson, by the goldsmith, we get to the point where where Pallava Grantha is being used. So it's the script which is being used, but not the language. And this is largely because the Pallavas, particularly Mahendravarman I and so on, they introduce a new script for the writing of inscriptions. And that script gets carried, but not so much the language. The Pallavas themselves are using Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is also used across the region in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, where the script is Pallava Grantha. Yes, Mattavilasa. Yeah. So it is a script that gets carried over and not the language. But the Pallavas are also very important from another point of view. the kind of concept of kingship that they introduce, and the kind of birudas or epithets that the king then starts using in his inscriptions to describe his personal qualifications. His personal qualifications as a great temple builder, his personal qualifications as a great promoter of the arts, of culture, so on and so forth. So there is a shift around the 4th, 5th centuries with the coming of the Pallavas within the larger worldview. The way the king sees himself, the way he wants to project himself, and the way he uses his inscriptions as a kind of, should one say, good social media network to promote what he is doing. So the Pallavas really mark a major intervention in the way in which the king sees himself and the way he promotes himself as a temple builder. Now, I must say this, that, this also gives then, when you read secondary literature and when you read temples, the name of the Pallavas, one always tends to think that it was only the kings who were building the temples. In most cases, the temples are there in earlier form, not so grand, very modest. But the king then, not all temples, the king then gives the money, and, the temples then get larger, and the king then puts his biruda that he's the temple builder and gets known as the person who builds the temples. Now, yesterday I had also pointed out the fact that many of the Buddhist sites which we were looking at in Andhra were coastal sites. Now, if you look at the Tamil temple sites, there are Kanchipuram is a major center inland, but if you see Thanjavur and if you see the coastal temples that the Pallavas built, the coast becomes quite significant, both for the Pallavas and later the Cholas. Another interesting development, not so much in the time of the Pallavas, are these merchant guilds which emerge. These merchant guilds guild is a wrong term to use, because in the context of medieval Europe, the guild has a very specific connotation. And hence, one should not use, perhaps, translate it as guild, but more as merchant associations. And there are many of these merchant associations. The Ayavole, the Manigramam, Nanadesi, and Anjuvanam. Now, the Anjuvanam, I would like you to bear in mind. I will come back to that because they are very different. The Manigramam and the Ayavole kind of merge with each other. They start in, and these are not so much Tamil Nadu merchant guilds. They start in Karnataka. I have said that in my third point, that the clustering is in the Dharwad, Bijapur area in Karnataka, and in Thanjavur and Tiruchirappalli districts. But these merchant guilds then move around across large parts of peninsular India. And, there's constant, after all, it's a long period that we are looking at, 9th to 14th century. You cannot have a static merchant guild, or a merchant association. It has to grow, it has to move. Sometimes they converge, and sometimes they come together, sometimes they break apart. But what they do, they are not controlled by the king. And I think we should bear that in mind. Of course, the king is interested in the revenues. No merchants can function unless they give revenues to the king. But the merchants themselves are quite powerful groups. They have craftspeople associated with them, many craftspeople, as you will see from my slide. But they also have private armies, because after all, they have to sort of protect their routes, whether they are caravan routes or whether they are sea routes. These merchant guilds maintain private armies. We know this because there are memorial stones which are set up, which the guild set up for these warriors who die protecting the guild. So these merchant guilds, one should see it in a much larger context rather than just looking at them as trade and, merchant organizations, because they are also associated in a big way with temples. They donate to temples. They are involved in temple administration. They build tanks for temples. So it's much more a larger social network that they are part of rather than only a very narrowly focused trade network. Now, the Anjuvanam, I told you, is very important, is different. Anjuvanam is found in coastal sites, but it starts with, not in Karnataka, but with this Kollam, Kerala inscription. And this inscription is fascinating because of the number of signatories to this inscription. And you can see that at the bottom of the slide, that the signatures are in a number of languages: Arabic, Pahlavi, Judeo-Persian, which means that the Kollam copper plates, this is part of one of the copper plates that you see here. The record is of donations to a Christian church. This is not to a temple. And the signatories are, should one say, foreigners, if one can use the term. But the languages that are mentioned there clearly indicate, the various communities, religious groups who are coming together as part of the Manigramam and the Anjuvanam merchant guilds, and the donation is made by the local ruler to the Christian church. Yeah.
Which one is that, Pahlavi?
I am not sure, because there are. Which one is? This one is Arabic. It's a signature that is in Pahlavi. The whole thing is not in Pahlavi. But I can give you the reference to this, and I can. Which one is? And the Judeo-Persian is interesting because these are people using the Arabic script, but they are not using the Arabic language. And there are a lot of papers. I don't want to go into that. I don't have time today to talk about it. The papers of which Goitain has edited, the Ganiza papers, but that's largely Western Indian Ocean. Sorry, you had a question? Okay.
This is in Chodapi.
This is before that, the 9th century. Yeah. Now, where are the Anjuvanam centers? These are largely coastal centers. I've talked about Kerala, but also Andhra, Tamil Nadu. We've talked about the Nestorian Christian Church at Kottayam, where the copper plates were, where the grant was made. And it refers to the Arab Muslims, the Jews, Christians, and Persians. And we have, by the 11th century, that the merchants, the Anjuvanam. Now, again, this is hard to say because, you only are basing yourself on very limited data, that they're largely Muslim traders, which comprise the Anjuvanam. But the Anjuvanam themselves are making donations in several parts of the coast, including in Andhra and Tamil Nadu. And they are also settled in Nagapattinam, which we will talk about later on, but also all the way Sri Lanka and Sumatra in Indonesia. So the Anjuvanam are by no means only between Arabia, India only. They sort of go eastward all the way up to Indonesia. And, one of the sad parts of post-independence history is that the role of religions coming in through the sea routes has seldom been discussed. And that's something that we need to sort of bear in mind and maybe take care of. So this is the Lad Khan temple in Karnataka, which is where an 8th century old Kannada inscription was found, which refers to the 500, who formed the Brahmins, the Chaturvedis or Brahmins, who were the 500, and they formed the Ayavole. And from this temple is quite a remarkable temple in that it doesn't sort of, it's not quite like on plan, quite like the other temples, because it has a huge open Sabha Mandapa right in front, and the inscription is found there. But the point that I was making earlier, that it is here that they start, and this is a Shiva temple, and it is here that they start, and then from here they take their operations elsewhere to large parts of South India. So let's move out of here and out of the inscriptions that I've discussed largely of South India, and look at what is happening in Southeast Asia. Because the movement to Southeast Asia, I think, is much earlier, which I've already said, but there are very interesting inscriptions, particularly the 9th century inscription. This is an inscription, again, I'll show you the map in a moment. It is from the south coast of Thailand, the Takuapa inscription, which refers to the Manigramam, and it refers to a tank which was dug there, and it says that this tank was protected by, and then there is a word which is used, which I think Nilakanta Shastri argued were warriors, but there's a whole lot of debate on that. I won't go there. But the fact remains that the Takuapa site itself, in addition to this inscription, has also yielded a large number of images, both Shiva and Vishnu images, and also Buddhist images. And there's a small brick shrine that is there. The second inscription that I think we need to take note of is this inscription, 1078, which was found at Baros, which is Sumatra, which is one of the islands of Indonesia. And this is quite an interesting inscription, because unlike that, this inscription talks about trade regulations. And it says that people who come to trade in this settlement must pay taxes, and what taxes they should pay, how much they should pay, and only then they can get off the ship and start trading. So it's very different from this, the Takuapa inscription. It doesn't replicate that. So the point I'm making is that these inscriptions relate to a whole range of themes, and you cannot sort of bracket them all into one or the other. And again, there's a 12th century inscription which again talks about trading regulations. And at this point, I should also mention that we are looking at Manigramam, which is one of the guilds which starts in South India. But there is a local Indonesian guild which is known as Banigramam, not the M, but the B. And that's a local guild. And then that, now why, that's again, very different where it operates. It doesn't operate as extensively as the Manigramam, but it's a local and a regional guild that we know of from the inscriptions. So this is the site of Takuapa, which I mentioned. It's there on the west coast. This is the narrowest part of the Malay Peninsula and the Isthmus of Kra. And here is, it's not an easy crossing because it's quite forested and quite hilly. But in terms of the distance, if you're wanting to go across from, or if you're coming from here and you want to go to the other side, or you want to go there, you have several possibilities. Either you go, that's a long way round, or you go here, or you cut across, across the peninsula. This is the Vishnu image that was found, which at the site of Takuapa. This inscription is not. You can see from the stone that it is not in a good shape. It is very badly damaged. The letters are it's hardly possible to read the letters, and there's only a provisional reading which has been made because of the state of the inscription and the fact that it is so damaged. So if we look at the overall inscriptions that have been found, they range over a long period, starting from 2nd century CE and going down all the way to the 13th and 14th century. Some of these inscriptions are in Tamil. And of course, I have also mentioned the fact that there's also the script which is used, but the languages are different. Let us look at some of the 13th century inscriptions. The reason being that at this time, in the 13th century, many of these Tamil inscriptions also refer to the merchants building temples. We had seen some of the early inscriptions talking only about trade regulations or talking about the building of tanks. But the 13th century inscriptions from Burma all the way up to China, that's a long area, a huge area. They refer to these merchants as also involved in temple construction. And the easternmost, of course, is this 13th century temple in coastal Fujian province, which was excavated in the 1930s. The inscription is a bilingual inscription, Chinese and Tamil. And there are stones which are preserved in the museum in China. There are also images that have been found, and there are a large number of stone carvings which remain. But there's quite a lot that is still to be discovered in China. That's only one of the panels that we have references to, that survives in its complete form. But there are many sort of images which are scattered all over South China.
The Hindus had gone all the way up to China. It was established already, or
Means in the this was found in 1930s.
Yeah, so at that time it was known that the so-called Indian people had already migrated on.
If you look at the historiography, and when people start writing about Indian influence or so-called Indianization, which today is not a word that's often used, but we already have early 20th century people writing on Indianization, but whether these discoveries come up only with these finds and the bilingual inscriptions. And there are more discoveries to be made. These are not all. These are some discoveries, the 1930s discoveries.
Buddhism traveled across, that is well established, but that these are Hindu gods, right?
Yes.
So that is surprising.
Yes. So we need to do, that's my point, that's the reason why I'm talking to all of you, that we need to do research, Otherwise, we never know. Otherwise, we just keep regurgitating whatever everybody else has said. But yes, I completely agree with you. Now, let's come to, good, you mentioned Buddhism. So let's look at Tamil Buddhist inscriptions. And there's another issue. We will come to that. In India, if you read any book, early medieval Tamil Nadu is always described as the land of temples. Never a land of Buddhists, right? So now, you just mentioned that the Buddhists are the only ones who are said to have gone across the waters, not the Hindus. But by the same token, our own history, prioritizes the Hindu temples over Buddhist remains in South India, which is not the case. So we have several inscriptions. Sri Lanka, is just sort of across the Pork Straits. So I won't talk more about the Sri Lankan inscriptions, but there are a large number of inscriptions, Tamil Buddhist inscriptions we are talking about now, not Tamil Hindu inscriptions. But this is an important inscription which is bilingual, Malay and Tamil. And, these inscriptions come from North Sumatra. So the point then is that, work, there was a fair amount of work. There was the Greater India Society which was set up. There was a fair amount of work, but it was kind of scattered. And in the historical discourse, it's really the colonial period diaspora which is talked about, people going outside India and so on. But you have much before that. One has all these people traveling across. And I had mentioned this Barus inscription, if you remember, where I had said that this is an inscription which talks about trade regulations. It refers to payment of taxes by ships, calling it barros, to the local representative of the Ayavore. And only then, after payment of taxes, could these people get off the ship. But the site of Sumatra is also less studied, but more important because of the finds of these Buddha images. This is granite. Granite doesn't occur in Sumatra. Granite occurs in Tamil Nadu. And I will show you, this is exactly in the Nagapattinam style, the seated Buddha image. The head is gone. This image, unfortunately, has disappeared. It was reported, but now we don't know where it is. But this is a major presence of Buddhism from Tamil Nadu as far east as Sumatra. Then you have Tamil inscriptions on Buddha images. And by the 9th century, the center of Buddhism had actually shifted from the north to the south. So Tamil is used for writing Buddhist grammar. Tamil is used for making donations of Buddha images. Tamil is also used for many of these inscriptions, which refer to the spread of Buddhism. And this is one of the donatory inscriptions on this Buddha image somewhere here, and which refers to a donation being made. Now, these images, as you will notice, see the ushnisha, see the headdress. It's more like a rising flame, which is very different from the earlier Buddha images that one sees from the north. But one sees this pattern in Sri Lanka, also in large parts of Southeast Asia. And I would now like to shift to the town of Nagapattinam. It's, as all of you know, it's known for its resources, its fishing resources. It's a town which was the center of the fishing communities. It was also a town which was damaged with the tsunami during the time of the tsunami. But it is already mentioned in devotional couplets in Tamil, which describe the waterways and ships at Nagapattinam. And often Nagapattinam is referred to as a port, based on the Sambanda's Tamil's inscriptions, Tamil writings. But perhaps one should also think of Nagapattinam as a religious center, because we know that there were, and I'll show you the remains, Buddhist remains dating from the 8th, 9th century, were found at Nagapattinam, and they survived well into the 19th century. And I will tell you what happened to them afterwards. So it was a sacred center, but it is also offered, I'm not going to talk about this, but the Cholas are said to have taken these naval expeditions to conquer Southeast Asia. So Nagapattinam is also said to be one of the points from which the ships left. That's where Nagapattinam district is. And if one looks at these areas around on that part of the coast, what one finds are a large number of coastal Buddhist sites, Kaveri Pumpattinam, and many others, which are Buddhist sites all around Nagapattinam. This is a 1784 a watercolor drawing, this and one more is the only evidence that we have of what this temple at Nagapattinam may have looked like. And this painting shows, it's an ink sketch. It talks about this as a Chinese pagoda. Why Chinese pagoda? Because the author thought that this looked like a Chinese pagoda rather than a Hindu temple or a Buddhist temple. Though, of course, the author, the painter refers to this as a Jain temple. Jainism was known to the painter, Buddhism was not known, so he doesn't talk about it as a Buddhist temple, but as a Jain temple. It is in the British Library. This is a drawing made in the 19th century, by Walter Elliot, who sailed down the east coast. And at that time, this was a major sort of coastal marker, should we say, because this is where people would disembark or get off the ship and then take the railway line, which brought them into the interior. There are two religious structures there are many more, but two religious structures which I will talk about: the Nagapattinam temple and the Kaya Rohana Swami temple, which is a Shiva temple, but is said to have 6th century origins. And what is interesting is, again, something which I've said yesterday as well, the diverse religious landscape in which we should locate Nagapattinam. North of Nagapattinam is Velankani. There's a famous church which is a major pilgrimage center, and Christian pilgrims come all the way from Philippines, to Velankani. There's also the Jain shrines at Tiruchirappalli, and there is a dargah very close to Nagaur, very close to Nagapattinam, which again is something that continued well into which still continues and is a main,
This rock fort is a Jain.
This is at Tiruchirappalli, not the fort itself, but there are names of Jain ascetics, and there are rock-cut shrines. The fort itself, not the fort, no, the shrines. Yeah, there are rock-cut shrines at Tiruchirappalli. Now, how do we know about Nagapattinam? How do we know about its importance? These are the Leiden copper plate inscriptions. These are all plates of copper strung together with a copper ring with a Chola seal attached to it to keep the rings together. And what they essentially say, they talk about donations that the Cholas made to Nagapattinam. And they talk about the fact, these are both in Sanskrit and Tamil, and they talk about a Churamani Vihar, which was constructed at Nagapattinam. But whom was it constructed by? The Shailendra king of Kadara. Now, where is Kadara? Kadara is in Srivijaya, which is Sumatra, or Java. Kadaram, yeah. And but that's in Indonesia, and it talks about this Nagapattana, which was known for its temples, water bodies, rest houses, pleasure gardens, and so on. So the interesting point is that the Cholas are giving donations to this Buddhist vihar, which has been set up. The Churamani Vihar at Nagapattinam. The temple was destroyed in 1856. It was demolished because the French Jesuits wanted to build a college there. Now, when it was pulled down, what they found was that under the temple there was a brick chamber, and there were bronze images of the Buddha with inscriptions in Tamil. When I'll show you the images when the temple, and since then. There are about more than, I think, 400 to 500 images, Buddhist bronze images, which have been found in that area, Nagapattinam district, also Kanchipuram. Selur is again one of them, and some of these are...
56.
Yes.
So which is the college there?
I'll show you. Wait. You have to wait. No, one second, wait. So these are this is of course new finds. This is from Selur. This is a subsequent find. But see the intricate bronze imagery from Selur. These are the other bronzes. These images have been scattered all across the world. So from New York to London to, wherever Nagapattinam bronzes have been found. The largest collection, still 85 or 86 bronzes, still remains with the Madras Museum. A lot of them are in reserve. Some are on display. This one they have just put out on display, but I think it needs better lighting arrangements. This is what was built in place of what was destroyed. But the college has since been moved. The college is no longer there. It was shifted to Trichy. So what we have is the district court. This building is a 19th century building built. Yeah. It's
Because it's a very old college.
yes, but it's yes. So that's another story of that college. But the point here is that what they say, we don't know where exactly this Buddhist Chudamani Vihar was, but they say that it was just behind this structure. So the point then is that, which makes it very difficult. Today, if you go to Nagapattinam, you don't see anything. You just see this. And then you suddenly see all these bronzes and you don't know where they come from. And, Yeah. This is part of this whole this whole structure. Yeah, this one. Yeah.
So
Yes.
originally the college which has been now used.
Yeah, for some other purpose, the district court. So now what is also very interesting. So I've talked about these bronzes, the Buddhist bronzes. But look at this Buddhist bronze. You would be hard put to differentiate this Avalokiteshvara from many of the standing Shiva images in the Madras Museum. What is equally interesting, look at the pedestal. Now, what this pedestal has are these hooks, and this was used for taking it out in procession, because you put a sort of beam and then it's carried on the shoulders of people and then it's taken out in procession. So the point then is, notice the transformation of Buddhism into something which is so close to Shaiv worship and Shaiv rituals that, the Buddha image is taken out in procession. Now, what is the other fascinating aspect of this whole story are these stone images. These are huge life-size images. I mean, if you travel around Nagapattinam district, Kanchipuram, that area, there are many, many places where you will, see these images. Now, who protects them? The local people. But what do they protect them as? People always protect them as something they know. They will not protect them as something which only academics know and nobody talks to them about. So this is, you see the Shaiv marks. And you see this all across Nagapattinam district if you travel, if you care to travel and if you care to notice. And in some cases, they say that, these granite images, some people from Southeast Asia, Buddhists from Southeast Asia, they come and they build a little shed. So, it's put there. But a large part of this is really protected by the local people. Or, yeah.
Near where the bronze thing was for a very long period.
Yeah.
They get aid there and brought to these places, or what's it?
That is another question, because India doesn't have tin, does have too much of tin. And the whole relationship of South India, which proliferates or, becomes very active in the 9th century onwards, what we call the Chola period, is it then, where is metal being traded? Where is the craftspeople being located? So it's not one place. I think there are many, many centers, but it has larger implications in terms of, where these bronzes were made. And if you're interested, the Hejia has a new book, The Thief Who Stole My Heart, where she discusses, where tin is coming from, where copper is coming from. Because, you can't make bronze if you don't have tin, and we don't have too much of tin. Now, this is in a museum. So these stone images are either, and Madras Museum also has a huge granite stone image. This has a Tamil inscription. Again, it's very badly damaged, and it's difficult to read it. That's the inscription at the back, but you can see that it's in a weathered and very difficult state. But there are almost 60 granite images that if you care to travel around, are still there. Some in museums, but a lot of them outside. There are Tamil inscriptions, and this, for example, is what I was talking about earlier, that Lord Buddha, this image is for the procession, festival procession of Lord Buddha, and was attached to the image house at Rajendra Chola Perumpalli. So you have these references to this whole transformation that also happened in Buddhism at this point of time. The other interesting place is the Kayarohana Swami temple at Nagapattinam, which again has inscriptions. But these inscriptions again are quite fascinating because they talk of donations and gifts that were made by the Srivijayan king, gifts of silver vessels, brass lamps, silver image of Shiva by the Srivijayan king. Then Sumatra. Yeah. We saw the copper, the Leiden copper plates, and then again you have an agent of the Srivijayan king installing an image, an Ardhanarishwar image, and donating and feeding Brahmins at this point.
This Kayarohana Swami temple is in Nagapattinam.
Yes, that's the Kayarohana Swami temple. Now, the temple itself today is renovated. This is a new temple. But, you don't worship in a temple which is old, right? It has to be renovated. It is made new. But it's a functioning temple. But if you go inside, you will find a lot of these small images attached, to the walls. There are inscriptions placed in the temple which are older. So the temple itself is a new structure, but what it has inside are, these earlier images and earlier sort of remnants of inscriptions. Now I'm going to go to my final point, and the final point I want to take up. The last 2 days we have been talking about appropriation and whether how much we should take the inscriptions or what is written in the inscriptions as gospel truth. I mean, it is true that the writing of Indian history shifted from using Sanskrit texts, the Purans, to inscriptions, particularly in the post-independence period. But are the inscriptions to be taken as historical documents, or are they as biased as other sources? So this is a point that I would now like to discuss, particularly in the context of this whole relationship of Buddhism and Shaivism and Vaishnavism. So let me start with an inscription. This is an inscription in the Mamallapuram Adivaraha cave. The cave itself is dedicated to both Vishnu and Shiva. The inscription is above a Harihara image, Hari and Hara, so both combined. And the inscription lists 10 avatars of Vishnu. And one of the avatars of Vishnu is Buddha, right? You have also Shaiv images here. Now, given the fact, and a lot of historians talk about this inscription and say after the 8th century, Buddha became the Purans say so, and the Buddha became an avatar of Vishnu and Buddhism declined. But I have just shown you that Buddhism was flourishing well into the 14th and 15th centuries. Let us look at some other evidence. Yes.
So it was there at that time.
In the 8th century, that inscription was put there, that Buddha is an avatar of Vishnu. But what does that inscription mean in historical terms? Did it mean Buddhism disappeared? No. Because you have these clusters, you have nearly 127 sites.
Buddhism disappeared after 9th century.
No, but I've just shown you 14th century Avalokitov.
In the stones, nobody can destroy.
No. But what about the images? I've just shown you bronze images of Nagapattinam, which is 16th century. There is a 15th century pilgrimage which talks about Nagapattinam as a coastal site where people from Sri Lanka stopped and went to Burma. And then Yes, literary. No. So we have...
So there are...
No, I think we should come back to this in a moment. Let me finish my... so we have three kinds of sources, which is the point I'm making. We have literary sources, we have inscriptions, and we have archaeological data, right? Now, what we tend to do is prioritize one or the other depending on which one we know and which one we are comfortable with. I'm saying that one source does not give you the whole picture. You need to look at all the sources to be able to get a complete picture. So by itself, an inscription saying something or a text saying something needs to be corroborated or validated against other kind of data. So my 8th century inscription, which says Buddha is an avatar of Vishnu, but then you have clusters of 127. There are 127 sites in Tamil Nadu which are Buddhist sites, coastal sites, and we have finds of bronze images, structural remains, so on. There's Kanchipuram. There are many life-size images of the Buddha found at Kanchipuram. Monks from Kanchi traveled all the way up to North India, Kurkihar, where they make donations and they gift bronzes. And of course, we have finds of stupa bases dated from the 4th to 9th century. This is one of the Kanchipuram granite stone images, which is still there. It is preserved. This is, I think, a school building. Yes, it is a school building, which preserves it. And yes, and the Manimekalai also talks about, Buddhism, Buddhist pilgrimage. Then there is the Buddhism and Shaivism. This was Buddhism and Vaishnavism, where Buddha isn't treated as an avatar of Vishnu. But you also have the Tripurantak image, where Shiva is supposed to have destroyed the cities by the demons. And, and the Purans have a whole lot of narratives and stories about it. And it's usually assumed that the Tripurantak, what was destroyed was the Buddha images and Buddhist sites. But when you look at Thanjavur is a royal temple. Remember those laden plates and remember the inscriptions. And remember the fact that the Cholas are making those inscriptions, making donations to a Buddhist site, Nagapattinam, the Chudamani Vihar. At the same time, in their royal temple, this is Brihadeshwar, the royal temple, and you have paintings. If you go inside, not outside, if you go inside in this inner vestibule, the first floor, there are these paintings here. And these paintings are really fascinating. I mean, normally it's not easy to get in. So you have, they're much damaged paintings. But there is this, there's a mural of Tripurantak Shiva, which is painted. And there is also the Buddha shown as an avatar of Vishnu.
Three umbrellas.
Chatras on top.
Doesn't that represent Mahavira?
So is Tripurantak killing the Jainas then? Or is he killing... See, the point is that this is a reconstruction. See, this painting is very damaged. And, so this is a reconstruction of that painting. And it's very hard to, because it's very dark inside. You must have, yeah. Yes, it's very dark and really claustrophobic. And the Archaeological Survey of India made some drawings, and this is from there. So if we look at going back to this, the point then I think we need to look at, the first point is a methodological point, which is that we need to look at many kinds of evidence before we decide what, a holistic picture of what happened, not just one or the other kind of evidence. And the second point that I would also like to make is that, the kings, we often read in secondary literature, XY, the Cholas were great Hindus, and they built Hindu temples, Yes. So, but then if you look on the ground, they're also donating to many other people. So the political structure or the polity does is to save their throne, or to save their kingdom. And one needs to read it with a pinch of salt as to, when they make these statements. The second point is that a lot of what is written or what is taken or what is published are the eulogies, the prashastis. Because by this time, by the 9th and 10th centuries, the inscriptions are very complex. So the first part of it is a prashasti, which is, eulogizing the king. So it's like me saying, I'm the biggest professor in all across the world, and I know everything, and what I don't know, nobody else knows, So now, well, if I'm powerful enough, you'll all agree with me. If I'm not powerful enough, you'll say, no, that's not true. So we should read the prashastis and we should read the inscriptions, particularly at this point, with a pinch of salt. The other point is that most of the work that's done is done based on the Sanskrit prashastis. The actual Tamil or the local language inscriptions, very few care to read because very few know the language. So then where are we while closing this? The point then remains, I'm almost on time. The point then remains that if we look at the way language script has been used, we find interesting variations starting from the 4th century BCE onwards, when the first Tamil Brahmi inscriptions occur, and then going on to the merchant guilds, their inscriptions, the recording of rules, so on and so forth. And the final point, and this is my favorite slide, the Nagapattinam, why is it called the Chinese pagoda? And this is near Shanghai. And, to the person who painted it, it looked very much like this. But the interesting part about this Qinglong pagoda is the fact that this is the Buddha in Parinirvan. This is the relic casket, which we have talked about yesterday. And that what it is known as is the Ashoka Tower. So there are many, many, what should one say, threads into this whole story. I have just given you one of the threads, which is based on these so-called Tamil inscriptions. But thank you very much. And I'm glad, yeah.
This pagoda is in China.
Yes.
But the artifacts in this tower base is the King Ashoka Tower. You're talking about Nagapattinam now. These coins.
No, I'm talking about this pagoda. Is known as King Ashoka's tower, and there are Buddha images, which are if you look at King Ashoka, there is a huge discourse on Ashoka all the way up to Korea, where Ashoka is supposed to have sent bronze to Korea to make Buddha images. He sent these relics to China, and this is the new one because, China, a lot of it was destroyed. This is a new one. But in all fairness, they've done excavations, and this was built in the 11th century, and which is closer to our Nagapattinam brick tower. Yes, yeah, absolutely. And then the other point also is that this is an interesting one, the memory of Ashok. Now again, who is Ashok? The Buddhist Dhammaraj Ashok? Or the Mauryan king Ashok? Who are we talking about? Because the Buddhist texts refer to him as the righteous ruler.
Yeah, we don't know.
Yes. So, history is complex, and that's why it's interesting, but it gets simplified when it sort of becomes, flattened out. So, thank you very much.
Questions, comments, sit.
Drawn up here.
Yeah.
Krishna, there is also conflict between Saivites and Vaishnava.
Yeah.
Terms of philosophical and other things also. Are there any, supposedly, that is a literary remarks, are there any archaeological or other evidences for some of these seas?
The archaeological evidences are not there, but yes, there are not just between Shaivas and Vaishnavas, but also between Buddhists, Jain, philosophically, and all philosophical texts. In their debates, they say that the Buddhists know nothing and the Jains know nothing, and we know the best, right?
But Isabella himself that
Yeah.
play actually accuses.
Yes. So, in literary sources, there are lots, in liberal the Purans. In a lot of literary texts, these debates occurred where, they're constantly debating in terms of who has the truth. So, yes. So, all of that is there. I'm not denying any of it.
So,
Yeah.
see, Pallava Grantha
Yeah.
script was used to encode multiple languages.
Yes. Yes.
But did similar thing happen to Tamil script? Did they encode non-Tamil language in Tamil script? Anyway,
Yeah, it's usually bilingual.
things, but
By all given. Where they're using the Tamil script and they're using the Tamil language, but there's another language. Or they're using it along with Sanskrit. So the Prashasti is in Sanskrit. And then you have the Tamil inscription.
the script itself was not used to encode a different language.
No, unless Tamil Brahmi,
That was early.
that was already, yeah, but Tamil script, no, okay, yeah.
No, I'm trying to figure out how the languages evolved.
Okay, yeah,
Or
yeah.
scripts.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So I wasn't there in your yesterday's talk. I seem to, unfortunately, missed. So the Tamil language and the Tamil script must be like separate, right?
See, you have to make a distinction between all languages and scripts. So Brahmi script is used for many languages, right? Sanskrit, Prakrit, Pali, Sinhala. Even some of the Khmer languages. Initially, they develop their own script. So then the Khmer script is used for the Khmer language. So you have to separate the two.
But so Tamil as a language was spoken, is it not like since when it has been spoken?
That, generally we operate the oral trivia in our dead foods.
Possible to.
Yeah, that is the issue. So I can only, when we have the evidence, I can only tell you that.
But regarding attacks on Jains and this, later periods around the times of Pallavas, that there were punishments given to Jain leaders.
Yeah.
They were put on the.
So what is the source?
Now, here there are painting sources and also some literary remarks which are actually written.
No, we are not talking literary remark, no, we're talking
written on the temples, and a large number of it.
yes.
They are part of that kind of.
Well, the paintings are quite problematic. If you go into Kanchipuram, the Vaikuntha Perumal temple, and there's people will tell you that the swans are there, the Chinese silver. He's being received by the Pandava king. He's meeting the Pandava king. So, and if you look at Dennis Hudson's book on the Vaikuntha Perumal temple, he reads entire Krishna Bhakti in those paintings. So my point is, see, who is punished, this is not an issue. My point is methodological. That most of the time, we read into evidence. The evidence, if it is to speak to us, it has to be more than one source. That is my basic methodological point. It cannot be one, whether literary, whether Purans, whether inscriptions, whatever it is. It has to be more than one.
No, I agree.
So we can continue this.
But in some sense, the fact that more or less Buddhism and Jainism died out in South India is a reflection of the fact that Hindus dominated in some way.
By the Buddhist tradition of monk. See, what died out? Monasticism. Yes.
Also, in some sense, this kind of appropriation of Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu. But that's not a function. Yeah. So, in some sense, it also destroyed the original religion, right? Because once you bring it as another god of Hinduism, that whole tenets of Buddha have disappeared.
What is original? And see that we have a core periphery model. So there is the original which happens in the north in Magadha.
Right, of course. Yeah.
Yes. So now the point is, Buddha is an avatar of Vishnu. 8th century. I've shown you the inscription. Buddhism continued very happily after that. Now, what does happen? See, Buddhism and Shaivism, there's a tremendous overlap. There is a Siddha tradition. No, there is a Siddha. See, the point is what people research and what people write. So the Siddha tradition, where the monasticism disappears.
That's what I meant.
Yes. So I'm not, but monasticism doesn't appear with the Buddha. Monasticism appears. The earliest monasteries are 3rd, 2nd centuries BCE, at least 300 years after the Buddha. So again, what we were doing with script and language, you have to break it up. Monasticism, the religion itself, and the transformation in the religion. So what does happen is that the tradition of asceticism, and the Siddha tradition in Shaivism, which is very little researched, there is an overlap, and there's a lot of back and forth between the Siddhas and the Buddhist ascetics. And the point also is that if we see, I've heard this that, but Buddhism disappears because there is no, does anybody talk about South Indian Buddhism? I know only of 2 people who do. There is Anne Movius, who's written a whole book on Tamil grammar and, the Buddhist notion of Tamil grammar, the way Buddhists use Tamil, not the way Hindus use Tamil. Who reads it? So my point is that, these granite images, what are they doing in Nagapattinam? These huge images in the 13th and 14th century. Yes.
For the tradition of Buddhists and Jains, even in 11th century, 12th century.
Yes.
In fact, in Tamil, in the literary word, there are supposed to be Aimbaringa. That is actually 5 epics are there. The 2 were written before Chalapadigharam and Manimegha, right? Much before all of us.
Yeah.
But the other 3 were written in 10th century, 11th century, or even this period. They were all written by Buddhist subjects.
So why are they written if there's no citizen in jail?
Oh, it is there. Point is trying to tell the political and control with the kingdom, etc.
But that is what that argument against, that political control. So we also know Cholas built all the temples. But did they? You know what the Cholas did? They were very smart, sorry. They converted the brick temples into stone temples. All right. And then they put their inscription. So what do we get today? We don't get brick temples. Brick temples decay. They disappear. We get stone temples with nice Chola inscriptions. So we say, all these temples were built by the Cholas. If any of you is interested, sorry, I didn't want to promote my own books, but I've come out with the Handbook of Hindu Temples, and there is a very long Tamil inscription which refers to how the Chola queens who were converting these brick temples into stone temples are the Chola queens. And there's a long inscription, Tamil inscription, which refers to, how this was done and so on and so forth. So if any of you is interested, please have a look at that book. Yeah.
Hinduism itself, the way we understand Hinduism in South India, is very different from this Ram sector.
Sure.
Hinduism of North India. So any study on that? Has anyone talked about all how, I've always grown up being told by grandmothers and such people that what we had in South India, they kind of appropriated those local deities, Mariamman, Karumariamman, they have now become part of the Hindu tradition. But is there any research on this?
There is, see, it is sort of in pockets, as it were. You must also remember, see, one of the things which I think there's been much less awareness is what happened in the 19th and 20th centuries with colonialism, right? And what happened in terms of religious identity. I'm not saying what happened to religion. There were many things which happened to religion. I will not go there. But what happened, and I mentioned this in the first talk as well. If you give a label, then you are stuck with that labels. So I think that the way in which modern religions develop, modern Hinduism or modern whatever else ism develops, is really a 19th, 20th century development, which is projected backwards to whatever period, you want to start.
So when was it that South Indians were labeled as Hindus?
When they were asked in the census by the British to say what were they, not just only South Indians, North Indians as well. The Buddhists don't call themselves Buddhists, right? What is Buddhism? They have also many sects, many, should one say, teachers, lineages. So, but these isms are all 19th and 20th century related to the
It'll be much more troublesome to study because of that.
Yes, but then it gets pushed back. You see, what we do very nicely, it's more difficult because ancient period there's so little sources. Then you've got to know, you know your literary sources, inscriptions, archaeology, this, that, and the other. It's very easy. You read a nice text written in, which talks about the modern period, and then you say, that's what happened in the 2nd century also. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I read that Japan has this Shinto and
Yes.
Buddhism, and there is a great
Yes.
like.
Yes.
Also, I read that there is something called integrated Shinto and
See, in Japan.
something that is the amalgamation of the two. So something like that is possible in the Indian.
No, see, what happens in Japan is that the state intervenes in a big way when, because the Buddhist monks, see, you need to look at who, now when we are talking about all these isms, whatever, whom are we talking about? Not the king, we are talking about the religious leaders. The king always takes, or whatever, takes advantage. Whosoever is powerful, fine, you get the money or don't get the money. So the Buddhist monasteries had become very powerful in Japan, where, they had large landed estates, which was also true in India, not just with Buddhism, but with temples, with Jainism, all of that. And Shintoism then makes a comeback. So the state does not allow the Buddhists to access all the resources. So they are reduced, but there's no integration. It's a sort of back and forth again. And the modern Japanese, and which is the point I was making earlier, the modern Japanese Buddhism is a 19th century Buddhism, modern Buddhism for the modern country. It's pushed back because you use the same terminology. If you say, if you're writing in the 20th century, you don't say this is 20th century Buddhism. You say Buddhism. And then you conveniently push it back to whenever it starts. So the integration is is always problematic. What does happen is hierarchies, or should one say, shifts to another area. But in Japan, the Buddhism is really modern Buddhism, which is really which is a 19th, 20th century Buddhism. It's not whatever they may claim, 6th century Buddhism that went to Japan.